Hello, everyone. My name is Roman Horbyk, and welcome to our guest seminar on nation branding after the Russo-Ukrainian War. The war has been going on since 2014, but it is only a large-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia on the 24th of February that became a true game changer in virtually any sphere of life. Nation branding is no exception. How have nation branding as a practice and the study of it changed, and how will they change in the near future? Today, we are really privileged to discuss it with two key scholars in the field of critical nation branding studies. Nadia Kaneva is Associate Professor and Director of Master of Arts Program in Media and Public Communication at Denver University. Nadia is one of the big names in critical nation branding studies and the author of a seminal article that laid one of the foundations for the subfield. Göran Bolin is our other guest and professor of media and communication studies at Södertörn University, and is among major scholars in the field, having worked with the problematics since the early 2000s, starting with Eurovision in Estonia, and more recently focusing on specifically the Ukrainian experience, which will be highlighted in the forthcoming book co-authored with Per Ståhlberg. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, without further ado, I would like to ask the question that is perhaps most pressing for the topic we are discussing today. The war has been going on in the current phase for 3 months now. So, Nadia, Göran, what do you see as perhaps the single greatest change or transformation for nation branding, both as practice and the field of critical study that the Russo-Ukrainian war is bringing on, or perhaps several changes if you find this formulation more appropriate? So Nadia, please, what is your perspective on this?
Thank you so much, Roman, and thank you everyone for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and also to have an occasion to reflect on some of these questions. So in academia, we have usually a very significant lag between the time that something major happens and the time research on it is completed and published. And in certain ways, in our very fast-paced environment that we live in now, this may seem frustrating at times, but it also gives us a chance to kind of quiet down and slow down and think and reflect. And we don't have that luxury right now because events are unfolding as we speak, and there's new information coming out every day. So I think I'll answer your question in a very tentative way, Roman. As far as the research goes, I think it's really too soon for us to notice any major changes in research, because as far as I know, the research on nation branding and how the war in Ukraine is affecting thinking or practices around nation branding hasn't been really done yet, although I'm sure there are people who are already formulating research projects around that. But in terms of just observations of what is happening, how it's happening, one of the major notable things for me as an observer is the fact that, to my knowledge, this is the first instance where we see nation branding. And when I say nation branding, I really mean a concerted commercial effort conducted by the government and a government institution being launched and happening in the middle of active war. And I don't know enough about it yet to really know whether that was something that was pre-planned to some extent, because as Roman pointed out, some form of war and military operations have been going on in Ukraine for 8 years now. And so I don't know if there were any plans for introducing a new nation branding campaign in case of escalation, which was also predicted in certain ways, or whether it's really a spontaneous response by certain aspects or institutions within the government. But to my knowledge, this is really unprecedented. There have been lots of different examples of using nation branding after a war or after any kind of major social conflict as a way to kind of reinvent the narrative about a nation and even to attempt to reconcile different parts of societies that were involved in conflict. But I'm not aware of any other examples where nation branding is really part of the, if you will, the toolkit of weapons of war. And in fact, just yesterday formally was the end of 3 months since the escalation of the war. And so just yesterday on social media, the Ministry of Information Technology of Ukraine was releasing new content, branded content, a video and some posters, which I'm sure will circulate in lots of other media as well. So what does that mean? How will it actually affect the conflict, if it does at all? Would it help Ukraine in some way? Is yet to be seen, but it certainly is a very unusual phenomenon.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for your really sharp and up-to-date observations. And Göran, what is your take on this?
Yes, thanks. Also, I should say thanks for inviting Nadia and me to reflect on these things. I mean, they are, of course, timely now, and my reflection is that along the same lines as Nadia, I mean, the things that we are seeing now put some of our previous assumptions to the test. That we have to sort of reevaluate some of our previous arguments or theoretizations about nation branding. And the example that you are giving, Nadia, is reflecting this. I mean, I remember I have had occasion to, since I'm writing also a piece for a journal that special issue that Nadia is editing, I have had occasion to reflect on this. So Per and I looked at our previous research, and we have an article from 2016 about identity work and identity in nation branding, where we said, and I quote, "No government would stage a branding campaign to win a war." I can now safely say that that assumption does no longer hold up, because this is what we are seeing now. We are seeing branding mixed with information management in relation to war. And as you kindly presented, Roman, me and Per Ståhlberg had just finished our book on our 8-9-year-long project on nation branding and information management in Ukraine, just before last autumn, and we were reviewing, according to the reviewers' commentaries, when the war happened. So we realized we had to rewrite the first chapter of that book because some of the things that we were written were, I mean, we couldn't pretend that there wasn't, that the war didn't happen. So this is, but this also made some of our, as we were revising that book, we were also thinking around these happening. Of course, we didn't have new empiric material, but we could sort of see this unfolding. And I shall show you some slides and some of the things that we, in a minute, what we argued in the book. And then we can actually draw the lines up to and reflect on the present situation. So I think I stop there for now. And
yeah, sure. Göran, of course, the forthcoming book that you co-wrote with Per, and that is based on your, I think, about 10-year experience of studying nation branding in Ukraine is a fascinating new addition to the field of nation branding studies, and we should absolutely focus on it in greater detail. So please tell us more about your key take-home lessons from the book and from your experience.
Yes, allow me to share my screen here, and I can show you some nice pictures from our research and explain in a bit. Let me see here. I'm just going to. Oh, there. So this is the title of the book that I've co-authored with Per Ståhlberg, who is a colleague of mine at Södertörn University. So the title is Managing Meaning in Ukraine, Information, Communication and Narration since the Euromaidan Revolution. As you can see, we don't use the concept of nation branding in the title, and this is on purpose because we forefronted the analytical concepts that we are using rather than the practice of nation branding. I mean, we are later going to discuss a bit about Nadia's article on nation branding in the post-communist world, where there is a distinction between the identity focus and the practice focus. And I would say that, I mean, Nadia rightly points to our Per's and mine focus on nation branding as a practice. So this is the title of the book, and of course we started in 2013 with our project, which was on nation branding campaigns in Ukraine. So Ukraine had this felt perception that they were invisible to the rest of the world. So anytime I use to present my slides and tell about this project before 24th of February this year, I used to show this slide because many people don't really know where Ukraine is, how big it actually is. But I think this map we have been accustomed to. We see this map almost every day in our news feeds, and the advancement of Russian troops and also the driving out or back of Russian troops. So this is not news, but the campaigns, the nation branding campaigns that Per and I was interested in was in relation to the Euro 2012 soccer championship, which Ukraine arranged together with Poland, and they had some slogans. Ukraine, all about you, which is a sort of a play with the letter U and the word you in Ukraine. And they also posted some interesting videos on CNN and BBC World. So this was on the one hand directed to tourists, on the other hand directed to business and investors. They also launched a new tourism brand in October in 2013. So we were doing field work. They had great plans for the tourist campaign to double the inflow of tourists from 25,000 in 2000 or 23,000 in 2012, and that would supposedly increase to 50,000 tourists in this year, in 2022. But of course, and one of their gems in this tourist campaign was, of course, Crimea and also other tourist resorts. But quite soon after, the Euromaidan revolution happened. We could see pictures from Ukraine that looked like this. So this was sort of protest aesthetics, you could say, that were played out. So and of course it was the ambitions for the tourist campaign decreased dramatically. However, what happened was that in the wake of these protests and the annexation of Crimea in 2014, in March 2014, and the war in Donbass, in Donetsk and Luhansk, in eastern Ukraine, made the tourist campaigning difficult. But Per and I also then became more and more interested, less and less interested in the tourist campaigns, and more interested in the way in which information in a broader sense of the world was managed in Ukraine. So, for example, let me see here, I skip a few slides here. I'll go into the so we were interested in who were the people managing information in Ukraine. And this is one of the ways, this picture that we hope we are trying to sell this picture to as a cover picture for the book. Let's see what the publisher says about that. This, when we were doing field work before the Euromaidan revolution, we interviewed people in public administration, political administration, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, etc., but also PR business, of course. And this banner that is on the Maidan, on the Independence Square in Kiev, was produced by some of our informants, not commissioned by the state government, but just because they wanted to set a mark on Maidan in connection to the Eurovision Song Contest, which they arranged in 2017. So to cut this very short, there are several people engaged in telling all the stories, as we say, with reference to George Gerbner. One of which is the Ministry of Information Policy, this is their logo, a new ministry that was founded in 2014. Later to be disorganized, but their activities merged within a new Ministry of Information and Culture. I can't recall the exact name now, but they were sort of managing information. So this was a state ministry, right? But you also had other agents like NGOs. Ukraine Crisis Media Center, again formed by some of our informants from the PR business, was a platform for press briefings by the government and by the military after the Crimean annexation and the war in Donbass. Another agent is the Stop Fake organization, formed by faculty and students at the Mohyla School of Journalism, to debunk fake news or disinformation that came foremost from Russia, but on the general debunking fake news about Ukraine all in all. There was also other television stations founded by oligarchs, Ukraine Today, for example. So there were a mixture of agents involved in managing this picture of Ukraine. There were also, secondly, also a lot of media technologies and forms involved. A lot of new streaming services appeared during the Euromaidan revolution. Hromadske television, for example, who did streaming from the protests, could look something like this during the whole, often uncommentated live streaming of people at the Maidan and adjacent streets, etc. And they were not alone. There were several other streaming services formed. So there was a mixture of media forms like mass media, but also these niche media. And of course, you had all the social media, the Twitter and Facebook, for example, and also Kontaktje, the Russian Facebook, and Odniklasniki, which is another social media site. So there were a mixture of more niche media and mass media, and images and stories, information circulated between these. They were, for example, I mean, it's often said that the Euromaidan revolution was started by a Facebook post by a famous, then quite famous Ukrainian journalist that called people to come to the Maidan to protest, to protest the then sitting government who refused to align with European Union. They were supposed to sign an association agreement, but in the last minute, then President Yanukovych backed out, and then students and citizens started to protest. And this is according to the main narrative produced from this event, is how it started. In fact, Mustafa Nayem, who is the name of the journalist, he himself says, well, I was not really alone in calling people to protest. So there was a mixture of these mass media and niche media. And then you also had what we call the high events of meaning management. We used some of the theories from Diane Katz's media events theory to try to analyze how the eventization of the Euromaidan revolution. This is again a picture from Cross Park in Kiev, also from 2017, when Ukraine arranged the Eurovision Song Contest, and they painted this arch in the rainbow colors. And this was, of course, a statement. I know, as many of you will know, Eurovision Song Contest has a large gay following, so the rainbow colors is in that sense appropriate to have during the week of Eurovision. But this arch is has a special meaning. It was raised in early 1980s during Soviet times to celebrate the friendship between the Russian and the Ukrainian people. So the two men standing there under the arch are supposed to represent Russia and Ukraine. And of course, this has now been very contested, this arch, since February, and has been toppled also. But this was also, again, the painting was also arranged by some of our informants in order to sort of, you could say, troll Russia. And if you remember, Russia eventually withdrew from that context. So I want to finish up with what we agents involved, a lot of actors involved in managing information towards international audiences in Ukraine, not only governmental agents, but also PR and strategic communication agents that also took on role that traditionally have been handled by state administration, like starting Ukraine Crisis Media Center as a press briefing platform for public statements. So they were actually an NGO who was talking in the name of the Ukrainian state, you could say. But PR people, they bring with them the tools and the practices and technologies and mindsets from their origins in PR. So this is what I think we could see then, and I think we can see now also in the war. So there is a lot of circulation of signs and text and stories between niche, social and mass media. I mean, the memes you can see of Ukrainian tractors today circulating, or the stamp of the Russian warship "Fuck You" stamp that was produced commentating on this Snake Island incident in the Black Sea. And the stories, the narratives are very fluid and fragmented, decontextualized and recontextualized, as we say, in a sort of a free flow between these different technologies, and picked up then also by international mass media, of course. And I think you all have seen some of these images circulating. But all of these things combined, we argue in the book, are constitutive what we call a new form of state, an informational state, that form the basis for some parametric or revolutionary changes on how states operate. We pick up these concepts from Sandra Brayman, a US scholar of legal studies, you could say, legal and policy studies. And we think that this is significant. And what we can see now, just to finish off, is after 24th February, we can see that the networks between state administration, public relations and strategic communication business, corporate communication, and NGOs, these networks that were formed during the Euromaidan are now again reactivated. And for example, if you take the videos that you can see behind Volodymyr Zelensky when he makes all his speeches in the European Parliament and elsewhere, they are actually also produced by some of our informants, some of these videos. I mean, the public relations agency Banda, for example, who has made many of these videos, they were also in charge of making the videos for the Eurovision Song Contest. So you can see that, and this would be my main takeaway from this, that what we can see now is a new alliances between public relations and state communication, more official state communication. I think I stopped there in order to not steal all of the time.
Excellent. Thank you so very much, Göran, for telling us about the book and telling us about the key takeaways, the key tenets that you'd like to bring forth with it. It is such an exciting project, and I think everybody in attendance is looking forward to it very much. And I think you gave us a great teaser for the book to come. I am hoping to react also to some of the ideas and points that you made. But before I do that, I would like to ask Nadia to reflect on what Göran just told us, and to reflect on these lessons and experiences. I know that you maybe didn't study Ukraine specifically, but you did use some Ukrainian material and Ukrainian cases to develop your theories. So I think you have a really interesting perspective on this. So what is your reaction to what Göran just told us?
Thank you, Roman. So yes, I have looked at examples from some of Ukraine's past campaigns, although I haven't done this really in-depth long-term study that Göran and Per have completed. But this was actually a very perfect introduction to provide context for what I was thinking of as I was listening to this. And as Göran noted, in their research, and also in this particular book, they have focused a lot on mapping out the institutions and the practices, right, that result in what we might call a Ukrainian national brand, but also other types of informational meaning and meaning making that's being produced by the state. And I want to talk a little bit about the other side of this, which is the identity part of the equation, which is where a lot of my research is focused. So to the extent that I've looked at Ukraine, I've done it in the context of looking at the broader region and how many former socialist countries, not only who were officially part of the Soviet Union, but also in the area, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, and so on, have used nation branding to try and reinvent their national identities. And so one of the most striking things here that was for me, as I was listening to Göran describe this process of evolution, was the following. So you all saw the image of the slogan, Ukraine, it's all about you, right? One of the early nation branding campaigns in Ukraine. And that was very much in line with what a lot of other former socialist countries were doing, which was that they were presenting to the rest of the world some sort of a brand narrative or brand identity, of which the main message was, we're just like you, right? We're no different from you. Don't be scared of us, even though we came out of this, decades-long communist system, and you've been told all these terrible things about us, but we're just like you. We're just modern people who want to live our lives, and we want to come and travel to your country, so lift the visas and come and visit us. We have nice nature and nice people and nice food and nice wine and so on. And I'm, being kind of a little bit sardonic here, but if you look at many of the nation branding materials from that time, not just from Ukraine, with pretty much any country in the region, that's more or less what they're saying. And you see numerous images of beautiful nature and beautiful young people in modern cities and so on and so forth. So now I'm not going to share my screen in the interest of time. But what I will put in the chat a link that if you want, you can open on your screens with the current nation branding campaign, or just one billboard that's based on it. And it's just a giant billboard with a blue background and yellow letters that says, "Be brave like Ukraine." So suddenly, well, actually not so suddenly, right? 10 years later, Ukraine finds itself presenting a very different brand narrative, where it's not about we're just like you, but it's exactly reversed. You should be like us. And to me, that's a very dramatic shift in perspective and messaging, and very interesting one, because to my knowledge, again, having studied the former socialist countries, this is the first example I have seen of this sort of proudly claiming some kind of national identity and then using it to inform a brand narrative that invites the rest of the world to be like Ukraine, as opposed to the other way around. I think potentially that's significant. What does it mean? I don't know. But that would be something that would probably, prompt me to then want to go and do a lot of research and to understand how is this shift accomplished. Some of it, I'm sure, was part of years and years of disinformation work that Göran and Per have been studying. But I also think that there are other shifts and changes in Ukrainian society beyond the mediation and communication of identities. And so there's certainly a lot of research that sociologists and anthropologists and political scientists and historians can do to kind of fill in the picture, right? And be able to offer some kind of explanation of how did Ukraine move from we're just like you to you should be like us. So I'll just leave it here, but that was really what stood out to me as I was listening to Göran right now.
Yeah, amazing, and I totally agree. We actually considered this example and the entire campaign bravery with the students in class, and it is really one of the more the striking examples of nation branding ever made, I guess, especially under such conditions. Nadia, you recently published also a new study and article where you sort of look back 10 years on your 2011 article on, let us say, 3 different strands of nation branding studies. So you summarize the experience of the field of sorts, and now just 1 year has passed, or perhaps less than that. But can you look back to this new recent article now after the war started, and how do you see the conclusions and the lessons you underlined in these texts? Do you agree with everything, or maybe some things that need to be revised? So will the same tendencies in nation branding in post-communist world continue? Has this war become a complete game changer? So how do you look back on your article that looks back on your seminal article?
So, well, for people in the audience who probably haven't read my 2 articles,
They have.
Well, okay. I just want to clarify that in both of those articles, the goal was really to sort of take a snapshot of the research on nation branding at the time, right? And so in a certain way, these are the kind of articles we write that are hopefully helpful to researchers in situating their own interests and their own projects within an academic field, but they don't necessarily explain real events in any particular country or place or region, because they're not relying on any sort of empirical data, and they're not really posing questions about real events in that sense. So to kind of reiterate something I said in the beginning, right? 1 year is really not enough time, and not enough new research has happened since my latest article came out to really be able to see where the field is headed. But with that said, I can make some guesses, I suppose, and we'll see, whether I end up being right or wrong. Or I can also make, I suppose, some wishes of where I would like the field to go going forward. So my guesses are that we're going to see a sort of a new wave of studies provoked by the war that would look at especially the digital aspect of branding and the social media engagement aspects of branding, both of which have so far, they have been studied somewhat, but they haven't been front and center in some of the research. And considering the highly networked nature of how media communication during the war has been evolving, and the very active use of social media by various actors in the Ukrainian government, that's my guess, is that we'll see a lot of studies about that. And that would be a good thing, right? We will probably learn a lot about it. My other guess is that we will see a lot of articles about Volodymyr Zelensky as a celebrity and as a brand. I'm interested in that, but I think it's unavoidable that we will see those kinds of studies. And the potential pitfall there might be that the kind of image that Zelensky is presenting to the rest of the world may be somewhat different from the kind of image maybe he has at home among Ukrainians. And so hopefully some of the studies at least would account for that, or would not just focus on representations in Western European or American media. So those 2 guesses I would venture. As far as, where I would hope and would like to see research going, one of the kind of ongoing themes within the research on nation branding over the years, which Göran and I have had many conversations about actually, is this idea of whether we can somehow separate national identities from nation brands, whether they're completely different, somewhat overlapping, one is influencing the other in some way, or they practically the same thing, right? And that's an ongoing debate, and you get different answers depending on who you ask. But I think the case of Ukraine would present a good opportunity to study this critically and to think through this theoretical dilemma, right? Of what is it to be Ukrainian, and by extension, what is it to claim any kind of national identity in this particular context of highly globalized, network, digitalized, but at the same time commercial media systems, and also in the context of war and in an effort to secure international support, right? So I would like to see people engaging with that more critically rather than just sort of describing the circulation of various images and memes and messages. Because for me, obviously that's an important question in the context of Ukraine, but it's also an important question in any kind of war environment. You know, if we think of Syria, if we think of Afghanistan, all in various other contexts, right? Palestine, there are various ways in which this kind of a collision of identities becomes mediated, and to what extent it's commercial mediation through branding and public relations intersects with the conflict. So that's one direction. The other thing that's very curious for me and that I would like to see more research is sort of what are the consequences of engaging with branding in the middle of a war. So in other words, now Ukraine and Ukrainians want to show the world that they're brave and that we should all be brave like them and with them and support them. But what happens at one point in the future, and hopefully that will be very soon, when the war is behind us, how does that kind of very specific narrative survive? Is it a resilient narrative? Does it end up becoming a platform for reconstruction and renewal, or does it become sort of a constraining narrative and a prison within which the future of Ukraine is sort of captured? And the same goes for some of the celebrities that have emerged from the conflict, right? Including the president of Ukraine. Does he then have to constantly live up to some sort of brand narrative about who he is and how he acts? And is he allowed any mistakes? Is he allowed any controversial political positions? Is he allowed any sort of controversial policies that he might want to present? And if Ukraine suddenly takes stances on the international arena that do not appear to be so brave or so popular, does the brand then provide some sort of cushion, or does it just collapse? So that's, of course, something that it will take a long time to be able to trace and follow these kind of things. But it's an interesting thing, right? And speaks also to Göran's comment about how we may be looking at a new form of statehood, right? Information statehood, and what does that actually mean for being able to conduct international relations and politics domestically? And then the last question, where I would like to see research, is also to what extent are these brand narratives actually inclusive of everyone in Ukraine? And that's not really a new question. People studying branding have been asking that a lot, right? But for instance, I'm just thinking about the new video that was just released yesterday by the Ministry of IT, which focuses especially on using digital technologies as part of the war. And it talks about Ukraine having a new digital army, right? And it shows a lot of young, very tech savvy people. But then I'm also thinking of seeing, you know, all these images of elderly, poor people in the villages of Ukraine. And somehow I don't think of them as the new digital army of Ukraine, although maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. But that's sort of like always the tension, right? Who and how is being included in these brand narratives? Is anything being left behind? And what are some of the consequences of that? So I'll just stop here so we have some time for questions.
Yeah, right. Amazing. Thank you so much, Nadia. And Göran, would you like to maybe reflect briefly on these ideas, hopes, and I don't know, maybe expectations?
Yeah. Yeah, very briefly, I think we can leave some room for questions, but,
Sure.
but traditionally the focus of branding studies and nation branding studies, much of the efforts have been put into studying questions on I mean, tourist campaigns. I mean, there's a wealth of analysis of various tourist campaigns. The other focus has been on campaigns directed towards investors. I mean, you remember in my slides, it was investors and tourists. That has been slightly less attention to that, but there are studies. The third part of branding is towards the political branding. I mean, it's not only directed to tourists and investors, but also to other politicians abroad, international politicians. And I think what we can see now is I mean, the support that Zelensky in his videos he asks for. I think we can see an increased attention to this aspect of branding to get support, international support for your country. I mean, yeah, there are several examples here we can see every day of that, and yeah, so yeah, I think I stop there and I leave some room for questions.
Sure.
I'm sure
thank you, Göran. Thank you so very much. A really interesting conversation, and I would like to also maybe add my 5 cents to this very briefly, because we certainly want to take some questions, and I would actually like to ask the audience, the public, to think about the questions you'd like to ask, and you might use the chat to pose questions, or you can also like raise hand or simply tune in and ask them, you know, verbally, orally. Yeah, so my reflection on this conversation, it is extremely interesting, and like you rightly said, it is perhaps too early to draw conclusions about many things, and there has been no empirical research done yet, at least not published. I guess we have to see it in context. So as we said a couple of times already, the war has been going on for 8 years. And back in 2014, when we look at Ukraine and also at Ukraine's army, but also at Ukraine's communication in the form of those very banal and expected sort of videos and campaigns that could be observed in any post-communist or post-Soviet country in principle, that really made Ukraine not unique, without any unique selling point, using the marketing terminology, and not recognizable. Of course, Ukraine was not efficient. It was not equipped to fight the war. So Russia was much more experienced in this, both militarily. I mean, they have fought wars throughout pretty much all the years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Starting from Transnistria to Georgia, Syria, and so on. And of course, they became very savvy in using also new technologies, the social media marketing, to sort of create these troll fabrics and apply astroturfing, not just at home, but also abroad, certainly in the post-Soviet countries, but also quite far-reachingly, even perhaps in the UK, in the US. I mean, the cases of Brexit, the Donald Trump election are really telling. And of course, Ukraine lagged behind, which sort of explains why the reaction to war was essentially a great uncertainty from the international community about what is happening. So it was like a battle of narrative that ended up in a draw, sort of, and which was eventually in favor of Russia. But when you are attacked with specific weapon, you need to learn to use it as well, to if this weapon is new and more efficient than what you possess. So that is what happened in Ukraine. Ukraine was forced to learn how to fight back in hybrid warfare using communications. And I think we are seeing now the results of this. So this is my reflection on the unique case of a concerted effort at nation branding at the times of war, something that Nadia started with. And then, of course, the balance between nation branding and nation building is something I agree totally that it is something that will probably sort of flipped in favor of the nation building being an inherent part of nation branding, perhaps a modern form of that nation building. So probably we'll see more of that tendency in studies of nation branding. And then also the one of the ideas that are connected to Göran and Per's idea of information state, of this essentially nation branding work as being decentered, networked, and diffused in a way. So, I mean, we have to look at any nation branding activity in the context of actors who are doing this, right? And the question that Göran asked runs, who are telling these narratives, who are telling these stories, right? So we'll see that. I mean, nation branding is typically understood as a concerted state effort, a state-led effort that is carried out either by state agencies or PR agencies that are hired to do that, with some involvement of citizens, perhaps in some cases of public diplomacy. Now we are seeing a fully diffused picture with a number of actors. Many of them have only very loose connection to the state, or perhaps have no relation whatsoever. So what does that tell us about nation branding as activity, and how do we study campaigns that stem from information? Yeah, so I'll just end here to save time for questions. And I see that Maria has a question, so please, over to you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I just have a kind of short question. You are talking about branding and PR practices, but in relation to the ongoing war, how would you distinguish it from war propaganda? I've been following the kind of the meme wars and also the social media, and I can see that there are different kinds of actors which I would consider also participating in the war propaganda, because there's also quite a lot of emotions involved, which is very interesting also seeing from the Finnish point of view, because in the beginning of the war there was kind of spontaneous gatherings or demonstrations in front of the Russian embassy in Helsinki, and also, for example, one of the most famous male choirs in Finland, the Ylioppilaskunnan Laulajat, had the flash mob there where they suddenly started singing the Finlandia hymn, which is highly symbolic because the Sibelius composed it during the Russification period, and then during the Winter War, or whether it was continuation war, the patriotic poet Koskeniemi wrote the lyrics, which
Mary, I think we.
War with the symbols and recontextualization of them, and it is very emotional. So that's my question is, how does this branding and PR practices, can they be differentiated from the war propaganda as a concept?
Is it a question to all participants? Yeah, okay. So Nadia, Göran, who'd like to try first?
Well, I can start. I don't think we can differentiate. Yes, I think PR and nation branding used in this context are part of war propaganda. There are, of course, some subtle differences in terms of who exactly is doing what and what kind of channels are they using, and who's paying it and so on. But ultimately, right, they do become entangled in the information war that surrounds the physical war. And I would say that's also not new, at least in the US context. War propaganda during the First and Second World War was effectively done and orchestrated by professionals who were recruited from the PR world, right, from the PR sector, and they wanted to be patriots and worked with the government and so on. So we're not necessarily seeing any kind of major shift here. The shifts are mainly, from my perspective, in the tools being used that have become available in the last years with new digital technologies and so on.
Yes, I mean, I think, yeah, I agree with what Nadia says. I mean, there's not really any distinction in that sense conceptually. And if you look at for example, Harold Laswell's book on propaganda during the First World War, he also picks up on popular culture and literature, etc., which is something I think have been forgotten. So I think it's a good exercise to return to the old classic studies, because you see things haven't changed that much since the 1920s when Harold Laswell did his studies.
Thank you. Well, I would just like to add that Göran and Per actually happened to have a really interesting discussion about propaganda as a concept in the book. So I think when the book is out, it would perhaps answer a lot of these things. I would say that propaganda has become quite laden with negative connotations. It is worth reminding that it was not at the time of its greatest spread, like in the 30s, 40s. It was not necessarily understood as necessarily malicious or deceptive. So propaganda was not seen as synonymous with deception or disinformation. And I think now we tend to actually overuse propaganda in the sense of disinformation. So we would speak, like back in the 40s, the 50s, we would speak about white propaganda, black propaganda, and gray propaganda, right? So this is an interesting discussion, which has to do with conceptual history, actually, how the concepts develop. All right, do we have any other questions? I think we can maybe take a couple of minutes over time if there is a question from students or faculty members. Hogne posted a question in chat, and I think Göran responded to it. So I don't know if you'd like to maybe reflect very briefly on this, Göran.
Well, it's just to expand on what I wrote in the chat. I mean, it's I mean, there are examples of regional branding. I mean, national regions like Öresund's. I mean, close to home, it's Öresund's region, which was a major branding campaigns. Jesper Falkheimer's PhD thesis is an excellent study of that campaign, and I think it boils down to whether someone sees an opportunity to sell something, and that doesn't necessarily have to be selling commercially. It can also be, like I said, selling a political ID. So yeah.
Yeah, I would add to that, you know, we've all seen the sort of endless procession of Western European politicians and American politicians going to visit Ukraine as part of their own self-branding efforts.
And
right?
celebrities.
And celebrities, yes. And so I think, yeah, your question is on point, right? That when you suddenly have what might be seen as a successful brand at the time, there are all kinds of attempts to co-brand or to sort of reinvent your own brand in that way. And actually, if we look at other countries that have really benefited from this, Poland comes to mind, because Poland had this somewhat bad reputation in Europe in the last few years because of the shift towards a very conservative government and its horrendous policies on women's rights. But suddenly now Poland has reinvented itself as this heroic nation that's helping Ukraine and completely changed its narrative. Whether that will be lasting, we don't know. I suppose we'll see. But yeah, there are these opportunistic attempts at co-branding and co-opting the Ukrainian brand, both at national and supranational and even individual politicians levels.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? All right, then I think we have come to a close. I would like to thank you so very much, both Nadia and Göran, for coming, for being able to join us and reflect together on this ongoing situation. Of course, yeah, it might be early to draw some conclusions, but it is important to keep the intellectual spirit and of debate and discussion and reflection around the ongoing events. So I'm really, really grateful for your time, for your effort. And of course, I'm very grateful to everyone who attended, who listened, reflected, and asked questions. So I think that was a really interesting and inspiring and thought-provoking event. So it would be interesting to revisit it in some time and see how some of these ideas and the predictions and hopes have developed in reality. So thanks everyone, and well, have a good afternoon. Bye.